In 43 days, federal regulators would request $2.8 million in flagged reimbursements, vendor transfers, and discretionary approvals from the company I had spent 9 years helping keep financially credible. It started with a mileage report I almost signed off on at 7:16 on a Tuesday morning. I remember the time because I am an accountant, and when my life began to split into before and after, it did so in 15-minute increments, inside a workbook with conditional formatting and a stale blueberry muffin hardening beside my keyboard. My name is Elena Marquez. I was 38 years old when I resigned from Caldera PetroCore in Houston, and until that Tuesday I had built a career around the assumption that if I was thorough enough, careful enough, and useful enough, facts would eventually matter more than rank. That assumption was not childish. It was merely expensive. I was senior manager of internal accounting controls on the 32nd floor of Caldera's headquarters downtown, a reflective tower of blue-tinted glass overlooking a tangle of freeways, cranes, and heat-shimmered concrete. On clear mornings, the sun hit the western conference rooms so hard the walls looked like polished water. On bad days, the whole building felt like an expensive lie refrigerated to 70 degrees. By the time this happened, I had been with Caldera for 9 years, 2 months, and 11 days. I had reduced quarter-close variance in our division from 4.9% to 0.8% over 6 reporting cycles. I had led the internal controls redesign after the 2021 acquisition of South Basin Logistics, reconciling 17 fractured reporting structures in 83 days. I had identified a procurement leakage issue that saved $11.4 million over 18 months. I had completed 27 straight quarters without a single material audit deficiency attached to my team. Those numbers mattered to me because they were not opinion. They were proof that I knew what I was doing in a company that increasingly preferred loyalty theater over competence. I did not arrive at that job untouched by life. Nobody my age does, even if corporate biographies try to make us sound machine-assembled. I was divorced at 34. My mother had moved in with me after her second knee surgery, which meant that for 14 months I was handling quarter close during the day and helping someone relearn stairs at night. My son Mateo was 11 when this started, and I had already missed 2 school award ceremonies, 1 middle school band concert, and an entire long weekend in San Antonio because a post-merger accrual issue had exploded on a Friday. I used to tell myself those were temporary trade-offs. Then I looked up and realized my whole adult life had been built in temporary pieces. If you had asked anyone at Caldera to describe me before this happened, they would have called me steady. Exact. Maybe intense. Not in a colorful way. In a fluorescent one. I am not the person who pounds a table in meetings. I am the person who waits until everyone else is finished speculating, then asks the question that makes the room less comfortable and more honest. That sounds braver than it felt. Most of the time it was just habit. I liked rules because rules, when written correctly, do not flirt, flatter, donate to golf tournaments, or marry into the executive suite. My weakness, if you want the truthful version, was that I hated conflict once it became personal. I could challenge a ledger, a process, an unsupported assumption. What I struggled with was the moment a disagreement stopped being about numbers and started becoming about power. I came from a family where money problems were discussed in whispers and public humiliation lingered for decades. I did not enjoy scenes. I did not enjoy office wars. I wanted the spreadsheet corrected, the policy applied, and everyone to go home. That is not heroic. It is just the temperament that made the next part harder. The mileage report belonged to Grant Holloway. Officially, Grant was Executive Director of Strategic Procurement Partnerships, which is one of those titles designed to sound simultaneously important and unverifiable. In practice, he floated between departments, signed off on vendor relationship expenses, inserted himself into capital planning conversations he barely understood, and had an office 2 doors down from the CFO for reasons no org chart could adequately explain. The reason, of course, was family. Grant was married to CFO Daniel Whitcomb's younger sister. That connection was never hidden exactly. It was handled the way wealthy people handle indoor mold, acknowledged just enough to maintain deniability, while everyone pretends the smell is normal. At holiday parties, they arrived together, but not 2 together. In meetings, Daniel referred to him as Grant with excessive formality, as though using his full first name could bleach the bloodline out of the room. Nobody said nepotism aloud because energy companies prefer their corruption dressed as tradition. Daniel Whitcomb was 52, Ivy League educated, surgically calm, and genuinely smart in the way dangerous people often are. I want to be precise about that. He was not a cartoon villain with a cigar and a vocabulary problem. He understood balance sheets, capital markets, debt structures, and people. Especially people. He knew exactly when to charm, when to delay, when to let subordinates punish someone on his behalf while keeping his own hands technically clean. He was admired by the board because he made complexity sound inevitable. He was admired by younger finance managers because he could make ruthlessness look like discipline. He frightened me long before I had evidence against him, which should tell you something. The mileage report itself was stupid in the banal way fraud often is at the beginning. Grant had submitted reimbursement for 1,184 miles over 8 days tied to vendor cultivation in Midland, Corpus Christi, and Baton Rouge. The attached hotel receipts placed him in Houston for 2 of those dates. The fuel charges overlapped with a car service invoice billed separately to an executive discretionary account. The meals were padded, but not cleverly. For steakhouse receipts. 2. Client entertainment, rounds at a private club. 1 line item for airport parking on a day his company travel profile showed no booked flight. I noticed it because the mileage rate had been entered incorrectly. Not because I was hunting fraud. Not because I had some prophetic suspicion. Because someone had used 91 cents per mile instead of the approved $0.655. It caught my eye, I opened the backup, and there it was, a small pile of lies held together by formatting. At 7:24 a.m., I emailed my analyst Priya asking her to hold the reimbursement batch. At 7:31 a.m., I ran Grant's prior 6 months of expenses. At 8:12 a.m., I had a spreadsheet showing repeated anomalies across 23 submissions totaling $64,870 in questionable reimbursements. Duplicate meal windows. Overlapping travel claims. Resort invoices attached to field diligence. Vague consultant entertainment entries lacking attendees. Small enough individually to be ignored, large enough in aggregate to become a pattern. That was the first layer. The second was worse because it reframed the first. What I didn't know yet was that Grant's expenses were only the visible leak. Once I started matching his discretionary approvals against procurement timing, I found vendor payments routed around ordinary review thresholds. Not massive transactions. That would have been vulgar. They were mid-sized, strategically fragmented, and almost always tied to suppliers whose pricing somehow escaped the scrutiny imposed on everyone else. One name repeated, Harlow Industrial Services. I had never heard of them, which in my role meant either they were very new or deliberately unremarkable. Their invoices were coded to site support, logistics advisement, and temporary field optimization. Over 11 months, they had billed Caldera $842,000. Their payment cadence was irregular. Their address led to a nondescript office park suite in Sugar Land shared, according to public records, with 2 other entities and 1 tax attorney whose website looked like it had survived 3 recessions. I pulled the approval chain. Grant initiated 14 of the 19 payments. Daniel approved 9 directly. The other 5 were pushed through by people 2 layers below him, usually within hours of contact from his office. At 10:06 a.m., I stopped eating the muffin. I should say something about Priya here, because she mattered early and in a way that complicated my understanding of courage. Priya Raman was 29, sharp, dryly funny, and disciplined enough to make junior staff nervous, without raising her voice. She had worked for me for 2 years and 4 months, and I trusted her because she had the rare gift of not panicking when numbers went strange. She also came from a family that considered stable employment a sacred object, so her risk tolerance was lower than mine in all the practical ways. She stepped into my office just after lunch carrying a notepad and closed the door behind her. "You asked me to hold Holloway's reimbursement," she said. "Accounts payable is asking whether that was intentional." It was. She nodded, glanced at my screen, and then at me. "How bad?" "Bad enough that I'm not putting it in an email yet." That got her attention. Is this a policy violation bad or a career-ending bad? I haven't decided whose career. She sat down without asking, which was unlike her. If this is about him, you need to think before you move. I am thinking. No, I mean strategically, not ethically. I leaned back and studied her. That's a very specific distinction. She gave me a look. I work here too. There it was. Not fear, exactly. Survival literacy. Priya was not telling me to ignore it. She was telling me that in a building like Caldera, truth and consequence did not move in straight lines. I respected that even as I disliked needing it. She asked if I wanted her to keep pulling prior approvals. I said yes. She asked if we were documenting outside the system. I said absolutely. She nodded once and left, which is how I knew she had decided to stay in the story whether it was wise or not. By 3:40 p.m., I had enough to elevate internally through formal channels. Under normal conditions, that would have meant submitting a controls escalation memo to finance compliance, copying legal only if materiality threshold suggested executive involvement. Under abnormal conditions, which is to say the conditions I was actually living in, it meant deciding whether the controls memo itself would become evidence against me later. I sent it anyway. Not the full version. The preliminary version. 5 pages, 3 appendices, tightly worded, no accusations beyond what the record supported. I flagged duplicate reimbursement indicators, non-compliant documentation, and approval concentration around one executive-related employee. I requested temporary suspension of pending discretionary reimbursements tied to Grant Holloway and a review of vendor Harlow Industrial Services for procurement irregularities. At 4:12 p.m., compliance acknowledged receipt. At 5:03 p.m., Daniel Whitcomb emailed me directly. Come by my office at 5:30. No need to include others. We'll sort out the noise. The noise. That phrase told me more than any receipt. His office sat on the 34th floor, larger than my first apartment, with west-facing windows, a shelf of energy policy books no one had opened recently, and a conference table heavy enough to imply history. When I walked in, Daniel was standing near the glass with his jacket off and his cufflinks placed neatly beside a decanter he almost certainly used as a prop more often than a vessel. "Elena," he said, warm and smooth. "Thanks for coming up." I sat. He remained standing for another 10 seconds. A positioning choice. People think power is all budgets and titles. Often it's just furniture choreography. He picked up my memo from the table, tapped it once, and said, "You do excellent work." Truly. Nobody questions your rigor. That is never a promising sentence. I folded my hands in my lap. Then I assume the concerns are being reviewed. He smiled. That depends what we mean by concerns. Duplicate reimbursements. Unsupported travel. Concentrated approvals. A vendor with irregular segmentation and no competitive justification. His eyes stayed on me, but the warmth had thinned. Grant's function requires flexibility. Relationship management at that level doesn't always fit neatly into staff accounting logic. There are few experiences more clarifying than hearing someone try to patronize you with your own field while saying nothing substantive. With respect, I said, expense policy is not a suggestion for people with relatives in finance. That landed. I saw it, not in his face, in the tiny stillness that passed through his shoulders. Then he sat. "Elena," he said, and now his voice was quieter, more confidential. "I think you've stumbled into something without full context." "Then give me the context." Harlow supports sensitive pre-bid coordination. Some invoices are deliberately generalized. Then legal can document the exception. That won't be necessary. I remember the hum of the air vent over his office more clearly than I remember his tie color. I remember a smear on the glass behind him where rain had dried into a pale mineral crescent. I remember feeling my heartbeat slow down, which is what it does when I stop hoping a conversation is honest and start measuring it instead. "I sent a controls memo," I said. "That process is already active." Daniel exhaled, almost amused. Processes can be redirected. There it was. Not a threat yet. A fact pattern. I'm not redirecting it. He looked at me for a long moment, then leaned back in his chair. "You have a strong future here if you don't let yourself become rigid." People who rise in this company learn the difference between technical correctness and institutional value. That was the first direct offer and the first direct warning, both dressed in the same suit. I said, if institutional value depends on fake mileage and cousin-approved invoices, your controls environment is fiction. Brother-in-law, technically, but I was past precision in family terminology. He did not raise his voice. Men like Daniel rarely do. He simply placed the memo on the table, aligned it with the edge, and said, I'm going to give you the benefit of assuming you're overtired. My fatigue has nothing to do with this. I think it does. You've had a lot on your plate. Your mother, your son, quarter-close pressure. I've heard you've been stretched thin. That chilled me because it meant he had been collecting softness around me. Personal details as future weapons. Not openly enough to sound monstrous. Just enough to imply fragility if needed. I stood. If that's all, I said, I need written confirmation that Harlow's exception status is approved by legal and procurement. His expression did not change, but his tone did. Just 1 degree colder. Be careful not to confuse persistence with judgment, Elena. I left without answering. What I didn't know yet was that by the next morning, the narrative had already started moving around me. I would learn later that Daniel called 2 senior directors that evening and described me as highly competent but increasingly inflexible under pressure. By 9 a.m. the next day, compliance had transferred my memo to a narrower internal review track instead of the executive risk channel it should have triggered. By noon, Grant's reimbursement batch had been manually released over my hold. That was the 3rd layer, and it was the one that made this personal. Until then, I was investigating a fraud pattern. After that, I was inside an active containment strategy. The visible sign came at 1:17 p.m. when Grant appeared at my office door without knocking. He was 46, tanned in a way that looked recreational rather than environmental, broad-shouldered, overconfident, and permanently scented like expensive cologne trying to win an argument. He wore his access badge clipped to his belt instead of his jacket, as if he were a visiting executive in his own fantasy life. Elena, he said, smiling. Heard you had questions. I stayed seated. I had documentation gaps. Some remain. He leaned against the doorframe. You know, people around here get real twisted up when they don't understand how senior deals work. I understand receipts. They're usually enough. He laughed like I had entertained him. You've always been a little intense. There are insults men use when they want a woman to know she has become inconvenient without giving her anything quotable for HR. I'm not discussing this informally, I said. His smile held, but his eyes hardened. Then let me say this informally. You don't want to make yourself the story over a few bookkeeping misunderstandings. Bookkeeping misunderstandings. I wrote that down after he left. If you've ever watched someone with borrowed power test whether you're still afraid of it, you know the exact silence that follows. I sat there with my hand resting on my mouse, the cursor blinking over an unfinished variance note, and understood 2 things at once. First, I was right. Second, being right was about to become the least stabilizing part of my week. So if you're listening to this, and you've ever felt that moment when a workplace problem stops being procedural and starts looking back at you, stay with me. Because what I uncovered next made fake expenses look almost quaint, and the way they tried to bury it told me everything I needed to know about how far family privilege will go when payroll, pride, and fraud are all sitting at the same table. CNE Moncho. GPT 5.4. I started building a parallel file that night. Not on my company laptop. Not on the shared drive. Not in any environment Daniel Whitcomb's office could later discover, freeze, reinterpret, or conveniently lose. I used my personal machine at my dining table after Mateo went to bed and my mother had taken her medication. I created a folder with a forgettable name, then built subfolders by category: expense anomalies, vendor records, approval chains, policy exceptions, reimbursement overrides, and communications. Documentation was not a dramatic weapon. It was simply the only thing in that building that still behaved consistently. What I didn't know yet was that the file would become more important than the original fraud pattern. The next layer came from Harlow Industrial Services. I spent the following 2 days doing the kind of work that makes people think accountants are boring right up until the part where we can reconstruct your entire life from timestamps and decimal places. I pulled invoice sequences, bank routing references available through approved payment metadata, vendor onboarding records, and change logs inside our procurement system. Harlow's onboarding packet was thin. Too thin. The vendor had been approved 13 months earlier under a strategic rapid engagement designation that bypassed the ordinary 3-bid documentation requirement for urgent operational support. The sponsoring executive was Grant. The final approval came from Daniel's office 42 minutes after procurement flagged missing tax substantiation. That by itself was suspicious, but still survivable if the underlying services were real. Then I compared Harlow's invoices to site activity. They didn't line up. 3 invoices totaling $118,400 were coded to field logistics support in counties where Caldera had no active deployment that month. 2 more were billed for temporary advisory staffing on dates our system showed no badge access for any Harlow personnel at the relevant facilities. 1 invoice for $37,900 referenced surge analysis during a tropical weather event that had occurred 6 weeks earlier and in a different region. When I mapped all 19 payments against project schedules, 11 of them had no clean operational match at all. That was when the problem stopped being padded expenses by an executive relative and became something wider, a payment route. I asked Priya to verify the badge access discrepancy through facilities, casually, without naming the vendor as a concern. She came back 90 minutes later with the kind of expression people get when they already know the answer is bad and want to confirm whether you do too. No entries, she said, closing my office door with her heel. Not for the dates you marked. I had dev in facilities run alternate spellings too. Nothing. Any subcontractor badge exceptions? Not documented. I nodded once and wrote it down. Priya stayed standing. Elena, if Harlow didn't show up, why were they paid? That's the question. No, she said. That's the dangerous version of the question. The practical version is who signed it knowing they didn't care. She was right. Again. What I didn't know yet was how many people had already trained themselves not to care. I needed a contradictory account, something from inside procurement that either validated the exception or exposed who had built it. So I spoke to Martin Kessler. Martin was 58, director of strategic sourcing, and the kind of man who made every sentence sound like it had first been vetted by a committee of risk managers. He had survived 4 reorganizations, 2 CEOs, and at least 1 ethics seminar he definitely treated as weather. He believed in process the way other people believe in blood pressure medication, not passionately, but with regularity. I asked if he had 10 minutes. He gave me 7. We met in a conference room near sourcing, one of those windowless boxes where every decision looks slightly more dishonest under LED light. I'm reviewing some prior vendor approvals, I said. Harlow Industrial Services. His eyes flicked once toward the glass in the door, then back to me. What about them? I can't find competitive bid support, field validation, or tax remediation before activation. I also see repeated payment fragmentation below the secondary review threshold. Martin folded his hands. Harlow came through executive fast track. I saw that. Then why are you asking me? Because procurement flagged incomplete backup. He took a breath through his nose. Elena, not every irregularity is misconduct. Sometimes operations moves faster than paperwork. That was one account. Cautious, procedural, plausible. Then I asked, did you recommend approval? A longer pause this time. I didn't block it. That answer mattered because it was not the same thing. Did anyone ask you to? Martin leaned back slightly. You need to be careful not to turn normal executive pressure into a conspiracy. There it was. Defensive minimization. I wrote it down afterward, almost verbatim. Then I spoke to Sandra Liu in vendor governance, and her account contradicted his almost immediately. Sandra was 43, impeccably organized, and had the brittle frankness of someone who had stopped expecting institutions to protect her but still expected them to file properly. When I mentioned Harlow, she looked at me for 3 full seconds and said that vendor should never have gone live. I kept my face neutral. Why? Because the beneficial ownership review was incomplete. That sentence changed the shape of the board in my head. Explain. We had partial entity records, she said. The registration chain was messy. Shared address, overlapping registered agent data, one updated W, 9 after initial submission. I pushed back. What happened? She gave a tiny humorless laugh. What always happens when someone upstairs wants a yes and your job only entitles you to paperwork. Who overrode it? I got a call from Daniel's chief of staff saying the CFO had visibility and the business urgency was approved. Martin's version had been, not every irregularity is misconduct. Sandra's version was, this vendor should never have gone live. Contradictions are useful. They reveal where fear enters the record. What did you do? I asked. I documented my objection in the workflow notes. I had not seen any workflow notes. Those notes aren't visible in the payment copy I pulled. They should be in the archived approval layer. Should be. That phrase does a lot of work in corporate postmortems. When I went back into the system, the archived approval layer had been modified 11 days earlier. Several metadata fields were intact, but the vendor governance annotation panel was blank. Not deleted exactly. Stripped. The structure remained, the comment chain did not. What I didn't know yet was whether that was deliberate tampering or some more ordinary digital vandalism performed under the comforting umbrella of system cleanup. What I did know was that Sandra remembered writing the objection, and I believed her. People who fabricate process details usually embellish. She did not. She remembered screen placement, the escalation code, and the wording ownership verification remains incomplete pending clarified controlling interest. That is not the kind of sentence anyone invents for drama. By the end of that week, my private file had grown to 63 documents and 14 pages of chronology. I still had not gone external. I want to be very clear about that. At this stage, I was still trying to solve the problem inside the system that had created it. That instinct was either principled or naive. Possibly both. The next piece reframed my understanding again. Quarterly merit increase modeling was due the following Monday. Every year, finance partnered with HR to calibrate raise pools against operating targets, inflation assumptions, retention risk, and division performance. It was one of the few times ordinary employees saw directly how leadership choices turned into lived consequences. 0.1% can mean groceries. One deferred band adjustment can mean another year of pretending loyalty is its own compensation. When I reviewed the draft allocation sheet, our controllable compensation pool for staff and manager raises had been cut by $1.7 million versus forecast. The stated reason was margin discipline tied to procurement overruns and executive support cost volatility. I stared at that line for a long time. Procurement overruns. Executive support cost volatility. In plain English, people across the finance and operations staff were about to receive smaller raises because someone needed room to absorb the very categories Grant and Harlow had been inflating. That was the moment the fraud stopped being abstract leakage and became theft with faces attached. At 6:40 p.m. that night, after everyone at home had gone to sleep, I reopened the raise model and traced the variance allocations. The suppressed increase affected 214 employees across 3 business units. Average reduction per person versus forecasted adjustment, 0.8%. Highest single reduction, 1.4%. Lowest, 0.3%. On paper, those numbers looked modest. In aggregate, they covered the exact kind of budget slippage Daniel's office was trying to keep invisible. I remember sitting there in the blue light of my screen, hearing the ice maker in my freezer crack once in the kitchen, and feeling something unusually simple settle in me. This was no longer a technical review. This was a transfer. What I didn't know yet was whether Daniel had set it up personally or merely chosen to protect it once it was useful. From a controls standpoint, the distinction mattered less than people think. Intent shapes legal exposure. Tolerance shapes culture. The following Monday, Daniel summoned me again. This time his tone was different from the first meeting. Less paternal. More managerial. He had decided persuasion was inefficient. When I entered his office, Grant was already there. That detail was instructive. Daniel wanted witness pressure without formal documentation. Grant wanted to enjoy himself. Daniel gestured to the chair. Close the door, Elena. I did not sit immediately. If this concerns my controls memo, compliance should be present. It concerns your judgment, Daniel said. So I sat. Grant crossed one ankle over the opposite knee and gave me the same smile men use when they think institutional proximity has turned them into gravity. Daniel slid a printed sheet toward me. It was a draft budget reconciliation summary for the executive support line, and embedded in it was a $412,000 discrepancy tied to prior accrual treatment. My initials appeared in the review footer. "I'm told this went through your team," he said. I scanned it once. This version didn't. It bears your approval code. The code is copied from a prior template. The underlying support tabs are missing. Grant leaned forward. "Are you saying your department loses control of reviewed files?" "I'm saying this document was altered." Daniel's expression remained neutral. "That's a serious allegation. It's an observable condition." The room went still in that narrow, airless way it does when language stops cooperating with intimidation. What I didn't know yet was that this was the first attempt to place me inside the irregularity before I could fully expose it. Not elegantly. Not permanently. Just enough to cloud authorship and make me hesitant. If I became defensive about my own process, I would have less time and credibility to press theirs. Daniel spoke first. "We all have blind spots under pressure." "I'm not blind." "No," he said. "But I am beginning to wonder whether you're overextending yourself." Grant added, "Maybe it's time to get some help on your side of the house." That was their move. Recast scrutiny as instability. I placed the reconciliation sheet back on the table. If there's concern about integrity of budget files, I want IT audit to pull version history for every executive support accrual package in the last 2 quarters. Grant laughed once. "You don't get to demand a forensic parade every time you panic." I turned to him. "This isn't your function. It is when you start muddying mine. There is no legitimate your function that includes duplicated travel, unsupported vendor billing, and fabricated review codes." Daniel's tone sharpened for the first time. "Enough." He folded his hands and spoke more slowly, which in his case meant he had stopped pretending this was collegial. "I'm going to make this simple. You are creating operational noise during compensation planning, quarter close, and board prep. You have raised concerns that are being evaluated appropriately. In the meantime, you will stop independently expanding this review, and any further findings will be routed through my office." "No." Grant looked almost delighted. Daniel did not. "No," he repeated. "No," I said. "Your office is implicated." What happened next mattered less for the content than the clarity. Daniel did not threaten me directly. He did something more sophisticated. He stood, walked to the window, and said, without turning around, "There are people here who have built decades of credibility. If you force this into a spectacle and you're wrong, there won't be a graceful way back for you." There it was. Not truth. Not policy. Consequence management. I answered him with the only thing I had left that still felt structurally sound. "Then it's fortunate I'm documenting everything." Grant's smile vanished. That was my leverage becoming visible, maybe for the first time in their minds. Until then, I think they assumed I was operating out of principle, maybe stubbornness, maybe personal offense. All containable. Documentation is different. Documentation survives tone. Documentation survives office politics. Documentation survives whether anyone likes me. If you've ever been in a workplace where the wrong people suddenly get very interested in your emotional state the moment you start preserving records, you already know why that mattered. And if this story is reminding you of someone who was told to be a team player right before the numbers stopped adding up, hit like and subscribe. Because the next layer was where I stopped wondering whether I had a problem and started proving they had built one on purpose. The retaliation began within 48 hours. My access to 2 vendor audit dashboards was removed pending role clarification. A promotion request for Priya that I had been sponsoring was frozen without explanation. I was left off a compensation calibration call I had attended for 3 consecutive years. Then, on Wednesday afternoon, HR scheduled me for a leadership resilience check-in. That title alone should have qualified as evidence. The meeting was with Tessa Rowe, senior HR business partner, 41, polished, empathetic in the highly managed way that made every kindness sound pre-approved. Unlike Daniel, Tessa did not intimidate by force. She softened surfaces until people forgot they were being steered. We sat in her office, where everything was beige enough to discourage memory. "I just wanted to connect," she said, crossing her legs and placing a legal pad on her knee. A few leaders have expressed concern that you seem under unusual strain. Name them. She smiled slightly. This isn't adversarial. Then names shouldn't be difficult. I'm here to support you. No, I said. You're here to establish a wellness narrative. To her credit, that interrupted her rhythm. Elena, she said carefully, sometimes high performers personalize normal business ambiguity. Unsupported reimbursements are not ambiguity. Incomplete ownership records are not ambiguity. Missing audit notes are not ambiguity. She lowered her voice. You need to think about how this is being perceived. That sentence interests me even now. Not whether I was right. How it was being perceived. By whom? I asked. She did not answer directly. Instead, she said, the company values your contributions. Nobody wants to see a strong career destabilized over misunderstandings. There it was again. Misunderstandings. A whole ecosystem of adults using preschool language to launder misconduct. I left that meeting with exactly what I expected and one thing I didn't. The expected part was clear. They were building a file on me. Not a fraud file. A temperament file. Something to suggest that my concerns were entangled with stress, rigidity, and interpersonal strain. The unexpected part came 20 minutes later, when Tessa emailed me a summary of our conversation and accidentally copied an internal note thread below it. Only 2 lines were visible in the preview pane before the system clipped the rest, but they were enough. Need consistency with Elena. If she escalates externally, prior wellness outreach helps. DW. Daniel Whitcomb. Not subtle. Not careful enough. I took a screenshot before the message was recalled 11 minutes later. That screenshot became document 64 in my private file. I wish I could tell you I felt triumphant. I didn't. I felt tired in a way numbers usually don't make me feel. Not intellectually tired. Cellular. The kind that settles behind the eyes when you realize the problem is not merely that someone powerful is dishonest. It's that multiple people have agreed to help make dishonesty look administrative. That night, after Matteo had gone to bed, I sat with my mother in the kitchen while she drank chamomile tea and folded the same dish towel 3 times because her knees hurt and repetitive tasks calmed her. She looked at me over the rim of her mug and said, "You have the face you had at 17. I almost smiled. That does not sound like a compliment. It means you're deciding whether to fight someone who can hurt you. I had not told her details. Not really. Just enough for her to know work was bad. What if I'm wrong? I asked. It was the first time I said it out loud. She set the mug down carefully. Are you wrong about the numbers? No. Are you wrong about what they're doing to you? I thought about Daniel's office. Grant in the chair. Tessa's note. Priya's frozen promotion. The compensation pool cut against fabricated overruns. No. Then maybe the question is not whether you're wrong. She folded the towel again. Maybe the question is whether you can afford the truth. That was not comfort. My mother was never ornamental with wisdom. She had spent 31 years working billing at a public hospital. She knew systems. She knew what survival costs. And for the first time, I genuinely doubted myself. Not the facts. Myself. I pictured losing my job, my insurance, my son's school stability, the mortgage, the careful scaffolding I had built after my divorce. I pictured Daniel surviving, Grant surviving, everyone surviving except the woman who insisted the receipts were real enough to matter. I sat there with my hands wrapped around a glass of water that had gone warm and understood exactly why most people stop. Not because they are weak. Because they do the arithmetic. What I didn't know yet was that the arithmetic was about to change again. 2 mornings later, Priya came into my office before 8 a.m. and shut the door so quickly the latch clicked hard. You need to see this, she said. She handed me a printed email chain she had received by mistake through a distribution list sync error. 3 messages. 1 from Daniel's chief of staff. 1 from Grant. 1 from someone in budget planning. The subject line, raise pool narrative. Inside, Grant complained that people are already whining about merit caps and suggested that finance tighten the message around macro headwinds and temporary project drag. Daniel's chief of staff replied that the CFO wanted all variance references kept high level and specifically noted that reimbursement and strategic vendor categories should not be broken out in manager-level explanations. Not proof of fraud by itself. Proof of concealment around consequence. That distinction was enough. I added the email chain to the file and, for the first time, made a list titled External Paths. Not because I wanted spectacle, because the internal routes were now functionally part of the problem. By then my chronology covered 19 days, 74 documents, 11 questionable Harlow invoices without operational support, $64,870 in suspicious reimbursements tied to grant, $842,000 in fragmented vendor payments, a $1.7 million raise pool reduction partially justified by categories they were actively obscuring, a recalled wellness email connecting outreach to external escalation risk, and one altered budget file carrying my approval code. Evidence changes your posture even before it changes your options. I was still afraid. I was also done being surprised. That matters. And the next conversation I had, the one that finally told me just how exposed Daniel thought he was, did not happen with legal, HR, or compliance. It happened in the parking garage with Grant at 7:08 p.m. after most of the floor had gone home and the concrete still held the day's heat like a grudge. Grant was leaning against a concrete pillar when I reached my car, his jacket off, sleeves rolled high enough to suggest he thought menace looked more authentic with forearms. The garage smelled like hot oil, damp concrete, and the faint metallic sourness of air that never fully circulates. Somewhere 2 levels above me, a door slammed. My heels clicked once, then stopped. "You've been busy," he said. "I work in accounting. That's usually the job." He smiled without warmth. "You know what I mean." I set my bag on the hood of my car and waited. I had learned by then that men like Grant often reveal more when they think they're delivering a warning than when they think they're being clever. He pushed off the pillar and took 2 steps toward me. Not enough to be dramatic. Enough to be deliberate. "Daniel's trying to keep this from becoming something unfortunate," he said. "But you keep dragging in people who don't belong in it. People like vendor governance. People like Priya. That got my attention." "What about her?" He shrugged. "Talented kid. Would be a shame if she got marked as not leadership material because she attached herself to the wrong fire." The sentence was smooth, almost bored. That's what made it ugly. Threats delivered with emotional detachment are always more revealing than shouted ones. They mean the speaker has practiced. I looked at him for a moment and said, "If you want to intimidate me, do it cleanly. Don't hide behind performance reviews." He laughed once. "You think this is intimidation?" "Elena, this is me telling you how companies work." "No," I said. "This is you telling me how theft works when it marries hierarchy." His face changed at that. Not much. Just enough for me to know I had hit the correct nerve. He stepped closer. "Be very careful using words like theft." I picked up my bag again. "Be very careful submitting words like mileage." Then I got into my car and locked the door before he could answer. I sat there for 47 seconds after he walked away, hands on the steering wheel, pulse elevated but controlled, and then I wrote the encounter down in my notes app before starting the engine. Time. Location. Exact phrasing. Mention of Priya. Tone. Distance. Nothing dramatic. Documentation turns adrenaline into structure. That night I moved from external paths to external sequence. If I was going to take this outside the company, I was not going to do it impulsively. I mapped the channels in order of legal leverage and evidentiary value. First, securities and accounting counsel. Second, regulator intake. Third, external employment attorney. Fourth, if necessary, targeted release of corroborating records to force institutional reaction. I had no interest in becoming a headline with no chronology behind it. My profession had trained me well in one respect: before you escalate, reconcile. What I didn't know yet was that Caldera was about to accelerate faster than I was. The next morning at 9:12, I was copied on a notice from Finance Operations announcing an urgent reconciliation review into an executive support accrual variance originating within internal controls review. My name was not on the notice. My approval code was. That was the scapegoat attempt becoming formal. The discrepancy was the same altered budget file Daniel had shown me, now wrapped in neutral process language and routed into a broader review as if my team had created the issue while examining it. Clever in a mid-level political way. If they could make me the source of accounting instability, then any further allegations I raised could be framed as deflection. I requested source files within 6 minutes. Denied within 22. The reason given was preservation protocol. That was useful. Preservation for whom? Priya appeared in my office before lunch, shut the door, and said, "They pulled me into a meeting with Tessa and Mark from Finance Ops." What did they ask? Whether you'd seemed distracted. Whether you ever asked anyone to reuse approval templates. Whether you were overwhelmed during close. She stopped, then added, "They wanted me to say you'd been slipping." Did you? No. I nodded. Then she said something I still think about. I almost did. I looked up at her. She did not look ashamed. She looked honest. Not because it's true. Because I got scared. My promotion's frozen. My dad just started chemo. I can't afford to be noble as a personality trait. That was one of the most human things anyone said to me in that building. I know, I said. She swallowed. I didn't say it. But I understood the price of not saying it. That mattered more than a speech would have. Courage under abstract conditions is branding. Courage while calculating medical bills is evidence of character. I told her to forward me nothing, print nothing, and only communicate with me about work matters in ways that would survive hostile review. She nodded. She was pale, but steady. At 3:40 that afternoon, compliance informed me that because my team's approval code appeared on the altered reconciliation package, I was being placed on temporary reporting restriction pending internal review. Not suspended. Not accused. Just professionally lowered into administrative fog. My system permissions were narrowed. My direct access to executive support files was cut off. A meeting invitation titled Process Accountability Conversation appeared for the next morning at 8:30. There is a point in some corporate crises where everything becomes simultaneously more obvious and more surreal. I drove home through Houston traffic, brake lights smeared red in the heat haze, and had the strange sensation of watching a bad decision model run exactly as designed. The company had discovered that the fastest way to neutralize a controls problem was to convert the controls person into a procedural distraction. At 7:55 p.m., after Mateo was in bed, I called an attorney recommended by an old audit contact. Her name was Veronica Shaw. White collar, former SEC, impossible to rush. She listened for 31 minutes without interrupting me once except to ask dates, system names, and whether any records had been created outside ordinary channels. Yes, I said. On my personal machine. Duplicates of what I could lawfully preserve. Notes, timelines, screenshots, metadata summaries. No trade secrets unrelated to the issue. No customer data. Good, she said. You sound careful. I'm terrified. That's separate. I almost smiled. Then she said the sentence that rearranged my timeline. If they've started constructing a retaliatory process record around you, your window for clean internal resolution is probably over. That's what I thought. No, she said. That's what you hoped wasn't true. She was right. We met the next day at 6:30 a.m. in her office, before the workday began. Veronica was in her late 40s, unadorned, direct, and so controlled that even her sympathy felt billable. I brought a printed chronology, a drive with organized exhibits, and a legal pad with 3 questions written across the top. What can be proved? What can be protected? What will it cost? She reviewed for 92 minutes, saying very little. Then she separated my materials into 3 piles. Pile 1. Likely supportable internal fraud and controls circumvention. Pile 2. Probable retaliation. Pile 3. Facts that mattered to me but would matter less legally unless tied back to 1 or 2. You have enough to make this expensive, she said. Do I have enough to win? That depends on what you mean by win. Fair question. I asked what she would do. She said, I would preserve, notify once through counsel, and if they continue retaliation or attempt to force a false admission, I would submit to regulators before they finish building a story around your supposed instability. It was cold advice. Correct advice. At 8:30 that morning, I went to the process accountability conversation. Tessa was there. So was Mark Delaney from Finance Operations, who looked like he had been born inside a khaki spreadsheet. Daniel was not present, which meant he was present structurally. Mark slid a packet toward me. We're reviewing a variance package tied to executive support accruals. Your approval code appears on a file later determined to contain unsupported entries totaling $412,000. I know the number. We need to understand whether there were process lapses in your team. The file was altered after my team's valid review cycle. Tessa spoke softly. Elena, this is an opportunity to clarify before assumptions harden. Interesting choice of verb. I asked for the source version audit trail. Mark said it was being handled. I asked by whom. He said, appropriate functions. I said, that usually means not the ones that would tell the truth quickly. Silence. Then Tessa leaned slightly forward and said, we've all been concerned that you've taken on too much. If there are mistakes connected to stress, now is the time to say so. There it was. The offer. Confess to exhaustion. Accept soften blame. Convert fraud into burnout. Give them a human error story, and they might let me leave with my insurance. I understood it instantly. I also understood why it works on people. For one full second, I thought about taking it. That is the least flattering part of this story, and therefore the part one trust most. I thought about my son. I thought about my mother's prescriptions. I thought about mortgage autopay. I thought about how easy it would be to say, yes, I was overwhelmed. Some review protocols may have slipped. I regret that. I thought about how many women before me had been professionally tranquilized with exactly that sentence. Then I looked at the packet, at my copied approval code on a file I had never actually signed in that form, and I heard my own mother's question from the kitchen. Can you afford the truth? Apparently not. But I was about to find out what lying would cost. No, I said. I will not characterize document alteration as my stress response. Mark's jaw tightened. Tessa's pen paused. I continued, because precision was the only thing in the room still behaving properly. I have repeatedly documented irregular reimbursements, vendor approval anomalies, and missing governance notes tied to executive-related transactions. Within days of doing so, my analyst's promotion was frozen, my access narrowed, and I was subjected to wellness framing. Now a manipulated file bearing my historical approval code is being used to open a process review around me. If you want my formal response, put that in the record. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Mark said, very carefully, this conversation may have implications you don't fully appreciate. I said, that's been true of every conversation I've had here for 3 weeks. I stood, collected nothing from the table, and walked out. At 11:14 a.m., Veronica sent Caldera's general counsel a formal preservation and retaliation notice on my behalf. At 4:52 p.m., before legal had substantively responded, Grant made his mistake. He emailed me directly from his company account. The subject line was one word enough. The body was only 3 lines. Stop spreading your confusion to people who can't protect you. You are not going to outlast this. Take the package when it comes. No greeting. No ambiguity. No self-control. I forwarded it to Veronica from my personal notes immediately after taking screenshots and preserving header information. She replied in 4 words, he just helped us. What I didn't know yet was how much. The package came the next morning. HR and legal offered me a resignation framework, 16 weeks severance, 6 months COBRA coverage, mutual non-disparagement, neutral reference language, and a statement that I was departing, to prioritize family and health after a period of unusual strain. In exchange, I would waive claims, cooperate in transition, and agree not to contact regulators using company information. There it was. Neatly priced silence. I declined before lunch. At 2:10 p.m., Veronica submitted a whistleblower package to the SEC and a separate complaint pathway tied to accounting controls, books and records integrity, executive override, and retaliation concerns. The submission included 86 organized exhibits, a 19-page chronology, metadata summaries, and preserved communications including Tessa's recalled note, Grant's enough email, the raise pool narrative thread, the Harlow onboarding anomalies, and the altered approval code sequence. At 3:03 p.m., she copied Caldera's general counsel with a narrower letter informing them that regulators had been contacted and that any further retaliatory action would be treated accordingly. That was the definitive power shift. Not emotionally. Structurally. Until that moment, Caldera could still imagine it was managing an employee issue. At 3:03 p.m., it became a regulatory event with timestamps. The company did not know exactly what had been submitted, but it knew enough to understand that if anyone kept improvising around me, the improvisation itself could become evidence. I felt the shift not because someone apologized or because a dramatic confession fell from the ceiling. I felt it in the silence. My phone stopped ringing. My calendar stopped changing. The soft pressure campaign went dead in a single afternoon, like someone had cut electricity to a counterfeit city. Daniel never contacted me directly again. What I later found out, through counsel and then through disclosed findings months later, was that legal locked multiple executive mailboxes that evening. Outside forensics was retained within 18 hours, and the board audit committee was briefed the following morning at 7 a.m. Grant, predictably, panicked in all the least elegant ways. I was told he tried to characterize the reimbursements as standard business development flexibility, then contractor confusion, then delegated administration. None of those explanations survived record matching. The mileage alone became almost comic under scrutiny. One date placed him claiming 214 reimbursable miles, while keycard logs showed him entering the executive gym at 6:12 p.m. and leaving the building at 8:03 p.m. with no travel record in between. Fraud is often undone not by brilliance, but by cardio. The Harlow issue took longer, because shell-like vendor structures always do. But forensic review linked Harlow's beneficial ownership to a trust connected to Grant's wife's family holdings through two intermediary entities, and one managing attorney, Sandra, had already flagged in the original onboarding concerns. Over 14 months, Harlow had received $917,300 from Caldera, not $842,000 as I first documented, because 3 late-cycle invoices had cleared after my access was cut. Of that amount, investigators later deemed $611,400 unsupported by deliverables or valid urgency exceptions. The company did not tell me these numbers immediately. I learned them in pieces through counsel, document productions, and later a settlement narrative no one intended me to read as closely as I did. My employment ended 12 days after the whistleblower submission. Not termination. Not quite resignation. I chose to resign in writing before they could continue the fiction that I was participating in some neutral process review. If I was going to leave, I wanted authorship over the sentence. My resignation email was 417 words. I sent it at 8:09 a.m. to Daniel, General Counsel, HR, Compliance, and the Audit Committee Chair. I wrote that I could no longer ethically remain at a company that tolerated executive override of controls, retaliatory manipulation of employee records, and financial concealment that directly affected compensation pools for ordinary staff. I wrote that the attempt to attribute altered documents to my team had confirmed the issue was not isolated misconduct, but institutional protection. I wrote that any future communication with me should go through counsel. And then, because precision can occasionally serve pleasure, I closed with this. I would rather explain my departure under oath than explain my continued employment to myself. Then I walked out. No speech in the atrium. No applause. No dramatic carrying of a banker's box through the lobby while interns watched. Real exits are usually quieter and more expensive than fantasy allows. Priya hugged me in the parking garage and cried for exactly 12 seconds before apologizing, which I told her was an absurd thing to apologize for. Tessa avoided eye contact when I turned in my badge. Mark nodded once, the way men do when a process they helped weaponize has become too legally radioactive to discuss. Daniel was behind a closed door. I got in my car, shut the door, and shook so hard I had to wait 9 minutes before driving. That was the climax as I lived it. Not triumph, but kinetic depletion. I had forced the evidence into a room where rank could not automatically bleach it clean. I had also detonated the job that paid my mortgage. The months after that were not clean. Caldera opened an internal investigation under outside counsel. The board announced a review of reimbursement governance, vendor onboarding controls, and retaliation safeguards. Daniel was placed on administrative leave, pending findings. Grant's access was revoked within a week, though the company publicly described his departure as a separation during review. Again, passive voice remains corporate America's favorite witness tampering device. 3 months later, Caldera disclosed in a regulatory filing that it had identified material weaknesses in aspects of its internal approval environment related to executive discretionary expenses and vendor exception processing. That phrase is dry enough to be used as insulation, but it mattered. Public companies do not confess control weaknesses for recreation. The filing also noted estimated remediation costs of $6.7 million over 2 quarters, including forensic review, legal expense, vendor revalidation, and compensation recalibration. Internal documents I later reviewed suggested the real cost was higher once delayed projects, reputational drag, and staff attrition were included. In the 2 quarters after my resignation, 37 finance and procurement employees left voluntarily. Some had good reasons unrelated to me. Some, I suspect, had simply watched enough. I filed my own retaliation and wrongful constructive discharge claims. That took 14 more months. This is where the ending became Pyrrhic. Yes, I won in the measurable sense. Caldera settled. The settlement amount was $1.92 million before taxes, attorney fees, and structured allocations. The company was required to strengthen anonymous reporting, add independent sign-off for executive-related vendor exceptions, and recalculate part of the suppressed merit pool for affected employees from the year in question. Priya eventually received her promotion retroactively with back pay. Sandra transferred to a different company and sent me a one-line email that said, "Accurate records remain fashionable." Veronica billed me enough to buy a small boat, but she earned it. And yet winning did not feel like victory in the muscular, cinematic way people like to narrate these stories. My mother's health worsened that winter. Chemo wasn't our crisis. That had been Priya's father. Ours was a fall and then a long recovery that made every courthouse call and legal strategy memo feel indecently abstract. Mateo took the whole ordeal harder than he admitted at first. One day I found him Googling, "Can your mom lose the house if she sues her company?" on the family laptop. That sentence did something to me no regulator ever could. I also discovered that once you become a whistleblower in a large industry, your resume enters rooms before you do wearing a warning label. Some people called me courageous. Far more called me high risk without using the phrase. I made final rounds for 3 roles and lost all 3 after backchannel reference anxiety mysteriously appeared. Nobody said, "We're worried you'll document us too." Nobody had to. For 11 months, I did consulting work no one dreams about as a child. Technical review projects. Control remediation memos. One contract involving duplicate freight accruals so dull I almost respected it. I worked from home at a folding table in the guest room while my son did homework 2 doors down and my mother watched courtroom dramas loud enough to qualify as public policy. The unexpected detail is that I developed an aversion to decanters. Any hotel lobby, executive office, or conference room with decorative whiskey sitting untouched in crystal made my shoulders tighten. Apparently, my nervous system had decided that curated amber liquid meant a man was about to explain corruption as sophistication. Daniel's fate was neither spectacular nor trivial. He resigned 5 months into the investigation. The official language said he was leaving to pursue other opportunities after helping ensure a stable transition. I later learned his separation package was sharply reduced from what his contract could have produced under cleaner conditions. He was not frog-marched from the building. He was not criminally charged, at least not as far as I know. He simply became less employable in exactly the circles he had spent 20 years cultivating. Last I heard, he took an advisory role at a private firm with a title vague enough to hide in. Grant was referred into a separate civil recovery action tied to the unsupported payments and reimbursements. I know Caldera clawed back some amount from him or his connected entities because the settlement summaries referenced partial recovery of $388,000. I do not know the private terms beyond that. I do know he stopped being invited to the kinds of conferences where lanyards are treated like moral certificates. Tessa remained at Caldera for another year, then left for a healthcare company. I have complicated feelings about her. She was not the architect. She was also not innocent. Entire systems rely on polished intermediaries who specialize in converting danger into concern. Mark stayed. That does not bother me as much as it once would have. Companies do not purge every enabling function after a scandal. They keep enough of the old wiring to reassure themselves the lights still work. As for me, I am 40 now. I work as Director of Controls and Ethics Oversight for a mid-sized infrastructure firm outside Houston with 1,800 employees, ugly carpet, functional coffee, and a CEO who once told me in my interview, "If you ever have to choose between making us uncomfortable and letting something rot, I expect discomfort." I made him repeat it. Then I asked for it in writing in my offer terms. He laughed. I didn't. My office is smaller than the one I had at Caldera. My title is arguably less glamorous. My salary, after the dust settled, is 14% lower than where I was on my old executive track path. And yet every month when I review approval workflows, I can feel the absence of that old contamination like clean air after industrial noise. Priya and I still talk. She sends me screenshots of badly coded dashboards and asks whether I miss the thrill of elite dysfunction. I do not. Veronica sends holiday cards with no handwritten note, which is exactly on brand. Sandra joined a manufacturing group and, according to LinkedIn, is terrorizing incomplete governance records in a different zip code. My mother is slower now but still sharp enough to ask, whenever she hears a politician say oversight is burdensome, to whom? Mateo is 15 and taller than me. He pretends he doesn't remember much from that year, but sometimes when we pass downtown and the Caldera Tower flashes in the distance, he says, "That place still looks fake." He's not wrong. If I sound less triumphant than you expected, that's because this kind of justice extracts a fee at every stage. I exposed the nepotism scam. I prevented them from planting their budget error on me. I forced disclosures, triggered remediation, and got money they would have preferred not to pay. Those are all wins. They are also all expensive. I lost professional innocence. I lost years of uncomplicated ambition. I lost the ability to believe that competence naturally protects the competent. And I lost, for a while, the ordinary anonymity of just being a woman who did her job well. That is why I call it a victory with teeth marks. Still, if you take me back to that Tuesday at 7:16 a.m., to the mileage report I almost signed, I know exactly what I would do. I would open the file. Because the real lesson of what happened to me is not that corruption always collapses under scrutiny. It doesn't. Sometimes it survives, restructures, hires consultants, and keeps hosting earnings calls. The lesson is narrower and therefore more useful. Fraud protected by family is rarely sophisticated at the point of origin. It survives because decent people keep treating each irregularity as isolated, each threat as temporary, each strange reimbursement as someone else's problem. By the time it becomes a scandal, it has usually already stolen from the people with the least leverage through frozen raises, blocked promotions, distorted budgets, and fear. That $1.7 million raise pool reduction never leaves me. Not like the $917,300 to Harlow. Not like the $64,870 in grants reimbursements. Not even like the $412,000 altered accrual file they tried to hang around my neck. What stays with me is the ordinary theft. The fact that 214 employees got less because two powerful men and the machinery around them decided access mattered more than rules. That's what turned me from cautious into immovable. So if you're listening to this and something at your job feels just slightly off, an approval that always skips the line, a relative who somehow never gets audited, a budget headwind that only seems to affect people without executive parking, don't start by asking whether it's dramatic enough to matter. Start by asking whether it repeats. Then document the repetition. That's my challenge to you. Not inspiration. Not a slogan. A challenge. The next time someone above you says, "It's just noise," ask yourself who benefits if you stop listening closely. And if you've ever watched favoritism drain real money out of a workplace, while everyone else was told to be grateful for scraps, tell me what the cover story was. I want the exact language. Because in my experience, the lie usually starts sounding official right before the numbers start screaming.